Rome could buy anyone. Consuls, juries, whole elections bought so openly that the price of a single vote rose and fell like the price of grain. That was not a flaw in Rome. That was Rome, the most sophisticated machine for purchasing human beings the ancient world ever built. Julius Caesar was the finest operator that machine ever produced. He bought senators with forgiven debt. He bought armies with land. He bought the crowd with games and bread, and when he needed the gods, he bought a well-timed omen. There seemed to be no account in Rome that Caesar's genius could not eventually open. And then he met one he could not. There was a man in that Senate who had no price. Not a high price. Not a stubborn price. No price at all. Because he had spent his entire life engineering himself so that nothing anyone could offer would register as a gain, and nothing anyone could threaten would register as a loss. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato. History remembers him as Cato the Younger. He was not a saint, and this is not a story about a saint. He was something stranger and more useful than a saint, an anomaly the system could not model. A variable that returned no value when the machine tried to price it. Caesar could buy the man who wanted power. He could buy the man who wanted safety or comfort or to be loved by the winning side. What he could not do. What nobody in Rome could do was buy a man who had trained himself to want none of it. Hold this question while we walk into the wreckage of a republic, because the whole hour bends back to it in the end. You who are building something, you who will one day be worth buying, what would it cost to make you unbuyable? Not what would it cost them. What would it cost you? Easy way to tell this story is as a morality tale. The good man in the corrupt city. The one lamp that would not go out. Set that reading aside. It is too small, too sentimental, and it will not help you build a single thing. Cato is not interesting because he was good. Cato is interesting because he was structurally sound. Look at what actually happened to the men around him. Pressure came. Bribery, fear, ambition, the slow gravitational drag of watching everyone else give in. And it bent them. It bent good men and bad men alike, because pressure does not care about your intentions, it cares about your design. A load finds the weakest member, and there it fails. What made Cato different was not that he wanted more virtue than other men. It was that he had built his character the way an engineer sinks a load-bearing wall, forces already calculated, foundation already driven deep, so that the same weight which flattened everyone else passed through him into the ground and moved him nothing. This is the reframe I need you to carry out of this whole essay. Integrity is not a feeling you have about yourself. It is not a mood, not a halo, not a thing you announce on the internet. It is an engineering property. It is the depth of your foundation measured against the load you will one day be made to bear. And here is why it is about you and not about a dead Roman. Everything you are building sits on top of your character. The company. The name. The body of work. If that foundation is shallow, it will not matter how tall or how beautiful the thing above it is. The first real storm finds the flaw, and the whole structure comes down. And it comes down, always, at the exact moment you needed it to stand. So the question is not the soft one, am I a good person? The question is colder and far more useful. How deep have I actually dug? What load can I carry before I bend? Let me name the core idea cleanly now, so we can build on it and then stress test it until it either holds or breaks. A man is almost never bought with money. He is bought with need. Money is only the crude form of the thing. a stand-in for what the money will get him. Rome did not corrupt men by handing them coins. Rome corrupted men through their appetites, their hunger for status, for comfort, for safety, for applause, for the warm animal feeling of belonging to the side that is winning. The coin was only the handle. The appetite was the lever. And once a man has an appetite that another party can feed or starve, that man has a price, whether or not he will ever admit it. He will tell you, honestly, that he cannot be bought. And he will mean it, right up until someone lays in front of him the one thing he could never stop wanting. Cato's move. And this is the whole genius of it, so slow down here, was not to resist the levers once they were pulled. It was to starve the levers before any hand could reach them. He studied himself the way a defender studies a fortress, hunting for the unguarded gate an enemy might use, and one by one, over years, he sealed them. He wanted less status, so status could not move him. He wanted less comfort, so discomfort could not threaten him. He wanted less applause, so disapproval found nothing to grip. This is what I mean by unbuyable, and I want the definition exact, because a blurry version of this idea is worse than useless. To be unbuyable is to want nothing that an outside party controls. Not to want nothing. Cato wanted a great deal. He wanted the Republic to survive. He wanted to act rightly, and he wanted it fiercely. But those were things no other hand held the keys to. Everything that could be granted or withheld by someone else, he had trained himself not to need. Hold that definition close. We are going to march it straight into the hardest thing a man can face and see whether it survives. Where does a mind like that come from? Our main source for nearly all of this is Plutarch, writing roughly 150 years after Cato died. Admiring, careful, but reconstructing scenes he could not possibly have witnessed. So take the stories as Plutarch's, shaped by his admiration, and watch instead for the pattern underneath, because the pattern is what's real. He tells us it started early, and it started strange. Cato was, by every account, an immovable child. There is one story that survived precisely because it is so telling. Rome was convulsing over whether to grant citizenship to its Italian allies, and a visiting leader was lodging in the family house, canvassing the household's children for support, half as a game. The other children agreed, as children do, wanting to please the powerful guest. Cato refused. And when the man, still half joking, seized the boy, held him out of a high window, and shook him, threatening to drop him if he would not say yes, the child simply hung there, silent, unmoved. He would not be frightened into agreement any more than he'd been flattered into it. Treat the scene gently. It is polished by a biographer's love. But the pattern it points at is iron, and as Cato grew, it hardened from temperament into method. He drove his own body toward austerity on purpose. He walked bareheaded through the heat of summer and the cold of winter. He went on foot where men of his rank rode. He owned little and wanted less. To Romans watching, this looked like eccentricity. A wealthy man playing at hardship for attention. It was nothing of the kind. It was drill. It was a man deliberately teaching his body and his appetites to need less, precisely so that less could ever be turned against him. Every comfort he learned to live without was one more lever quietly lifted out of the hands of anyone who might, one day, want to move him. This is the origin of the architecture from a moment ago. He was not born unbendable. He built himself that way. One refused comfort at a time, long before any man with real power thought him worth the trouble of bending. Before we go on, one quiet word, and then straight back to Rome. If this way of thinking is useful to you, if you are not here to be entertained but to actually build a life that cannot be bought out from under you, then subscribe and stay. This channel is not built for the crowd. It's a workshop for a small number of men who are constructing something real instead of consuming another man's noise. That's the whole entry requirement. You are building, not just watching. If that's you, you're already one of us. Now, back to Rome, and the first time Cato's architecture was put under real load. Here is the hard truth about integrity. It is unproven, and therefore not yet real, until money and power actually run through your hands. A man who has never held the treasury cannot call himself incorruptible. He has simply never been asked the question. In 65 BC, Cato was asked. He took the office of quaestor, which put him in charge of the Roman treasury, and understand who actually ran that treasury. Not the elected magistrates, who arrived and departed on a yearly clock. It was run by a class of permanent clerks who had been embedded there for decades. They knew where every body was buried, because they had helped dig the graves. They handled the forged authorizations, the quiet write-offs, the debts that were never collected from the well-connected, the payments that were never made to the ordinary citizen who was owed. The usual pattern was simple. A new magistrate arrived, discovered the machine was too intricate and too entrenched to fight, and made his accommodation with it. That was just how it went. Cato did not make the accommodation. He refused every ordinary one. He hunted down and collected the old public debts everyone had agreed to forget. He promptly paid out what the state genuinely owed to ordinary men who'd been stiffed for years. He prosecuted the corrupt clerks and shattered the quiet cartel that had run the money of Rome for a generation. He would not honor even a forged order simply because honoring it was convenient. Plutarch tells us Cato brought the quaestorship into greater esteem than the Senate. And that is Plutarch summarizing the example Cato set, not a line from Cato's own mouth. He taught the city, by demonstration, that Rome could be rich without treating its own citizens unjustly. Sit with that, because it is the first real load test of everything we've described. The machine of graft met a component it could not corrode. And instead of the machine reshaping the man reshaped the office. That only happens when the money is real, the power is real, and the temptation is standing in the room breathing on you. Which is exactly why integrity you have never once had the chance to betray is not yet integrity at all. It is only an untested claim. The treasury was the load test. Cyprus was the perfect crime he chose not to commit. In 58 BC, Cato was sent to the island of Cyprus to take charge of the treasure of its dead king and carry that wealth back to Rome. Understand the setup, because it is the exact circumstance every corrupt man quietly dreams of. He was far from home. There was no meaningful oversight. The sums were enormous. The inventory was his to write, in his own hand, and no one back in Rome had any independent way of knowing what the treasure had actually held in the first place. This is the precise situation in which nearly every other man in history has skimmed. Ad absurdum fetuitated, not out of grand villainy, but because the opportunity was total. The accountability was zero, and the human mind is extraordinarily good at explaining to itself why it is owed just a little. Cato accounted for every coin. He kept meticulous records. And here is the detail that matters most, the one to carry home. He kept the records in duplicate, 2 copies. So the accounting could survive scrutiny, could survive the loss of a single ledger at sea, could survive even his own future temptation to quietly revise the story later. Now lift the practice out of the history and hold it, because it is worth more than any amount of admiration for a dead man. Cato did not rely on his willpower in the moment. He did not stand on that dock and heroically summon virtue against the pull of all that gold. He built a system that made the theft structurally impossible, records so clean, so redundant, so witnessed, that there was simply no gap left for corruption to live in. Closely at what that means, he distrusted his own future self. He assumed a later version of him. Tired, resentful, rationalizing, telling himself a story about what he was owed, might one day reach for what was not his. And he engineered the situation in advance so that later self would arrive to find no opening left to reach through. That is the unbuyable man's true relationship with discipline, and it is almost the opposite of what people think discipline is. He does not trust himself to be strong under pressure. He removes the pressure's opportunity before it can ever arrive. Willpower fails. Architecture holds. So let me pull the whole method out of the history and hand it to you directly, because everything up to this point is worthless if it stays buried in Rome. You are going to be bought, or you are not, on ordinary Tuesdays. Not in some grand cinematic test with a soundtrack. In the small transactions that never announce themselves as transactions at all. Here is the discipline of becoming unbuyable. In plain terms, 4 moves. First, audit what you need that someone else controls. Actually do it. Sit down and name it on paper. Whose approval regulates your mood before you've even had coffee? Whose money holds your lifestyle hostage? Whose good opinion could you genuinely not survive losing? Every honest answer is a lever with another person's hand already resting on it. And you cannot defend a gate you refuse to even look at. Second, reduce your fixed appetites deliberately, the way Cato went bareheaded into the cold. Learn to need less status, less comfort, less applause, not because those things are evil, but because every appetite you shrink is a handle you quietly take back into your own hand. The man who can be content with little cannot be priced with much. Third, keep your accounts clean enough to survive daylight. Your literal accounts and your figurative ones. Owe no quiet favor you would be ashamed to hear read aloud in a room. A hidden debt is a lever you handed to someone else and then talked yourself into forgetting you were holding. And fourth, this is the one that actually saves you. Decide your non-negotiables in advance, in the calm, before any pressure has arrived. Name the 2 or 3 things you will not sell, and name them now, while nothing is on the table and your judgment is clean. Because the offer, when it comes, will not come labeled as corruption. It will come dressed as reason. It will arrive on your worst day, when you are tired and afraid and behind on rent, and the case for compromise will sound perfectly, seductively sensible. A decision made in that moment is not a decision at all. It is a surrender wearing a decision's costume. The line you drew in the calm is the only line that will still be standing in the storm. Now I have to complicate all of this, because if I leave it as pure admiration, I am lying to you. And this channel does not lie to you, even when the truth is less flattering than the legend. Cato's rigidity had a price. It was steep, and the honest historians have never pretended otherwise. The very same architecture that made him incorruptible also made him inflexible to the point of self-defeat. He could be obstinate where obstinacy served no one and nothing. He treated compromise as contamination, even when compromise was the only tool left that might have worked. And there is a serious argument, made by serious historians, not by his enemies, that Cato's absolute refusal to bend actually helped push the Republic toward the very collapse he spent his entire life trying to prevent. That by blocking every deal, by refusing every settlement that might have kept ambitious, dangerous men inside the system, he helped drive those men to smash the system from the outside instead. The wall that will not move sometimes becomes the exact reason the flood decides to go over the top. So here is the deeper truth, and it is the hardest thing in this whole essay to hold in your hand without dropping one half of it. Unbuyable is not the same as unbending. From the inside, they feel identical. That is the trap. And they are not the same thing at all. To be unbuyable is to refuse to sell what genuinely matters. To be merely unbending is to refuse to move even when moving is right. And that is not integrity anymore. That is vanity, wearing integrity's clothes and speaking in integrity's voice. Principle without judgment curdles into its own kind of corruption. The man so in love with his own consistency that he will let the whole house burn to the ground rather than adjust a single position has not transcended his ego. He has simply relocated it into his own righteousness, where it is harder to see and impossible to argue with. So the discipline is not only to build the wall, it is to know, with hard-won and honest wisdom, when the wall actually matters and when it is merely your pride demanding that someone build it a monument. Hold the line without flinching on the things that are truly not for sale. But do not mistake every stubbornness for a principle, or you will spend your whole foundation defending ground that was never worth the cost of holding. Which brings us to Utica, and to a night in the spring of 46 BC, when everything Cato had built across a lifetime was finally tested by the one force he could not out-engineer. The Civil War was over. Caesar had won. Cato, who had opposed him publicly and privately for the whole length of his career, was cornered in the North African town of Utica with the shattered remnant of the losing side. And the offer on the table was the most seductive one Caesar ever extended to any human being. It was clemency. Caesar was famous for it, almost defined by it. Pardon, mercy, your life and your comforts and your future all handed gently back to you. All Cato had to do was accept it and live. But Cato saw, with terrible and total clarity, the transaction hiding underneath the mercy. To accept the pardon was to concede that Caesar held the rightful power to grant it. It was to agree, in that single act, that Cato's own life was now Caesar's. Caesar's to give, Caesar's to take, Caesar's to hold as a debt forever. It was, at the very last, to be bought, to owe your own existence to the one man whose right to rule you had denied with every day of your life. The pardon was not a gift. It was the final purchase, and the price was ownership of the ledger of his soul. According to Plutarch, I say according to Plutarch deliberately and clearly, because this is a private scene, reconstructed generations later, dramatized, not transcribed by any witness, Cato spent that last night reading Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, the Phaedo. Twice he discovered his sword had been quietly taken from the room by his own son, who feared exactly what he intended. Twice he demanded it back. And then, rather than let Caesar own the last thing he still held, he took his own life. I hand you this with gravity, and with restraint, and with a hard line drawn around it, because it matters more than anything that I get this part right. This is not a template. It is not an instruction. It is the terminal logic of one ancient man who had priced himself at nothing. The extreme, final, irreversible expression of a life spent refusing to let any other hand author his terms. Take the principle, which is true, and which is yours to keep, that no outside hand should ever hold the deed to your soul. Leave the act itself in Utica, where it belongs, and where it must stay. Here is what actually makes the ending land, and it is not the death. It is what the death did to the man who had won everything. When word reached Caesar that Cato was dead, that his enemy had chosen to die rather than accept the mercy that would have quietly bound him forever. Caesar, according to Plutarch, said something extraordinary, something no conqueror is supposed to feel. Cato, I grudge you your death, as you grudged me the honor of saving your life. Read that twice, because there is an entire philosophy compressed inside a single bitter sentence. Caesar, a man who could buy anything, who had bought the whole of Rome down to its gods, is standing over the one account he was never able to open, and what he feels is not triumph. It is loss. Real loss. He had wanted to spare Cato, not out of tenderness, but because sparing him would have completed the collection. It would have made even Cato, at the very end, a man who owed Caesar something. And Cato, with his final act, had denied him precisely that. The one man Caesar could not add to his holdings became the one man he could not stop thinking about. And here is the meaning turn. Strange, and worth the entire hour. The unbuyable man wins a permanent and peculiar kind of power, a power the buyer can never reach and never touch. Because he cannot be owned, he also cannot be erased. Caesar owned Rome and is remembered 2,000 years on as a man who took. Cato owned nothing on earth but himself, and is remembered as the one man who could not be taken. Let that reorganize something in you. What you refuse to sell is the only part of you that outlives you. Everything you can be bought for is temporary by definition. It belongs, in the end, to whoever finally met the price. But the thing you would not sell at any cost, in any currency, on any day, that becomes the shape your name keeps holding long after everything else you owned has been spent and scattered and forgotten. Now come all the way home, out of Rome and into your own life, because your life is the only place this was ever really about. You will not face Caesar. No one is going to hold your life out of a high window or offer you a tyrant's pardon in a North African town at the end of a lost war. Your test will be smaller than that, and far more dangerous, precisely because it is small enough to fail without ever once noticing that a test was happening. You will not face one great purchase. You will face 1,000 tiny ones. Compromise that pays extraordinarily well and asks only that you quietly stop asking one particular question. The applause that becomes yours the instant you soften a principle just slightly. Just this once. Just for this one room. Just to keep the peace. The comfort that gently buys your silence. So smoothly and so reasonably that you will later call it maturity and mean it. This is the empire you actually live inside. Not Rome. The marketplace in your own chest, where every single day, quietly and without ceremony, the world places its bids on you. And here is the freeing, terrible truth. Most men are sold long before they ever once imagined they might be for sale. They were bought in increments so small that no single increment ever felt like a sale. A softened line here, an unasked question there. Until one day, the whole man belongs to someone else, and he cannot name the moment he changed hands. Let me state the thesis of this entire essay as plainly as I know how, now that you can feel the actual weight of it. Freedom is not having many options. That is the counterfeit the marketplace sells you. More choices, more doors, more things you could acquire. As though a man with 100 appetites and the money to feed every one of them were somehow free. He is the most owned man alive. He simply has expensive owners, and a great many of them. Real freedom is the exact opposite. Freedom is needing nothing that an outside party can revoke. It is having so few levers left exposed that the market, for all its patience and all its money, finally runs out of ways to move you. The free man is not the one holding the most. He is the one who can least be threatened with loss. Rome could buy anyone. We began there. Now you can hear the line differently, from the inside. The question was never whether the world will try to buy you. It will. It will not stop. It will be patient, and it will be clever, and it will come to know your appetites better than you know them yourself, and it will offer you exactly, precisely, those. That part is not up to you, and it never was. What is up to you? The only part that has ever been up to you is what you will refuse to sell when the offer finally comes. So decide it now, not in the moment the offer arrives, dressed as reason, landing on your hardest day. You will be too tired then, and the case for surrender will sound too sensible, and a decision made under that exact weight is not a decision at all. Decide it here, in the calm, while nothing is on the table and your judgment is still clean. Name the thing that is not for sale. 2 things, 3 at the very most. The principles you will hold on to precisely when holding them starts to cost you. The lines you will not cross for any figure the world is able to name. Write them down somewhere your future self will not be able to pretend he forgot. Because that decision, made in advance, in the quiet, is the foundation that every other thing you build will stand on top of. The company, the name, the body of work, all of it, resting finally on the one part of you that was never once for sale. Rome could buy anyone. Be the account it cannot open. A man priced at nothing owns everything that matters about himself. That is the single possession no empire, no Caesar, and no offer arriving on your very worst day will ever be able to take out of your hands.